John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com. Some Eagles news on the horizon here, and obviously some NFL offseason news as well. We'll start off bringing John in here on a Wednesday, John, and according to some reports out there, there might not be just Carson Wentz that will be missing camp. There could be another major Eagle that will not be ready for training camp due to an injury he suffered during training camp last year. Who would have thought?
Yeah, a little bit of a strange story, only because if you remember back in training camp, Alshon Jeffrey missed quite a bit of time. Doug Peterson described it as sort of maintenance-related, just trying to manage him because he had injuries in the past and was trying to get him to week one. Now, if that turns out to be this injury, hey, the Eagles are in some issue here because he was never on the injury report, at least for a shoulder injury. So if you talk about at times he was on there for other issues, that part of it's fine. But obviously you're supposed to put injured players on the injury report. You can be fined. So to me, it seems like a bit of a strange story. Obviously he's had surgery. That's the more important part. But there's a lot of players after an NFL season that have things they have to have taken care of. That's just part of this sport. It's a very hard sport on your body, obviously. But the fact that this was all the way back to training camp is, as I said, a bit of a surprise.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point by you, that the Eagles never would have put that out on the injury report all season long, and apparently he injured this rotator cuff back in Eagles training camp. So you're talking back in July and August he was possibly playing through this injury.
Yeah, and as I said, we were all kind of shaking our heads and trying to figure out why they were managing him the way they were back in training camp, because he did miss quite a bit of time, and they downplayed it. You don't have to report injuries in the off season. So there's always that gamesmanship of not really being up front about it. And that part, as I said, in August, that's fine. But once you get to the regular season, you have to report these types of injuries. So if this was that bad the entire season, I would be stunned, to be honest, because, again, you have to put that on the injury report at some point. Now, the fact that he's having surgery indicates it was injured at some point, or it could be wear and tear. That's the type of injury that is a wear and tear injury.
Yeah. Now, some reports out there, including Les Bowen of the Inquirer, the Daily News, reported that the goal is for him to be ready for week one, but that he could be ready during the preseason. So that's suggesting that he could have potentially missed training camp here, and might not play in any of the preseason games.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be all that concerned. I mean, last year had that perfect example. If you go back, Alshon barely played anyway. Throughout, and missed a lot of practices, missed a lot of camp as they tried to get to him to week one. And that's the way the NFL is going as a whole. We talked about it a lot. The preseason has always been meaningless, but back under the old system before the new CBA, it was meaningful for the teams to get guys ready. Now, wins or losses never matter. But you really, really wanted to get guys ready for the regular season as best you could. Under the new CBA, and it seems to be just increasing as each year goes by, the more important aspect from a coach's perspective is just to get his key players healthy for the regular season. And if that means missing the entire preseason, that means missing the entire preseason. Nobody seems to care. And almost those first two games or so serve as sort of the preseason in the modern day of the NFL. You try to get guys up to speed that way. It seems to be they've waited and come to the conclusion it's more important to get guys healthy for the regular season. I don't necessarily disagree with it, so I wouldn't be concerned at all about anybody missing preseason games.
Yeah, and the one thing is, obviously the Eagles are bringing back essentially the same offense. So he doesn't have to learn a new offense and all that stuff. If you're going to a new team or you're getting they're getting a new coordinator, but the offense isn't going to change all that much. So that should at least be something that keeps you, at least not being too concerned about Jeffrey missing a lot of time.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I don't even think it's a concern at all, to be honest. If you want somebody, I mean, sure, you want to get a little bit of the rust knocked off.
I just hate hearing John, that your starting quarterback, he might not have any preseason or any camp or anything. And now your top wide receiver, it has like the start of the makings of one of those stories as this season just got off to a bumpy start and never got back on the rails. We've seen a lot of teams get derailed after making those long runs the year before.
Well, sure. I mean, that kind of stuff is real, Super Bowl hangovers and that kind of stuff. But I think that is more of a relation to the fact that you tend to get a little satisfied after you win that trophy. And it's human nature to sort of take the foot off the gas a little bit. And I think that's sort of a personality type thing, and that's a motivation type thing you have to do with the entire team. As far as key players playing in the preseason, I just don't think it's important in today's NFL. I don't think it's ever been less important. I really don't. I talk about it all the time when we talk about Carson Wentz coming back from this ACL injury. Adrian Peterson during his MVP year showed up week one, didn't play one snap in the preseason, didn't do anything essentially, didn't practice, showed up week one, was the MVP that year. Now, that's an outlier. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but that's sort of the mentality with the star player. You know what Alshon Jeffrey is. Alshon Jeffrey doesn't need the preseason. Would it be better if he was completely healthy and could do all-season work and conditioning and all that kind of stuff? Of course. But, he's a veteran guy. If he's healthy, he's going to show up and he's going to play, and he's going to play well.
John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com, at JF McMullen. Right after you got off yesterday, the Eagles announced that Chris Peduzzi, their trainer, is going to step down, which would seem like, okay, who cares, ho-hum. But how valuable and important are those guys? This is going to be, the second, they had just had a trainer recently leave. Rick Burkholder went to Kansas City with Andy Reid. Chris stepped in, and now they're going to have change. I mean, and people don't realize sometimes that these guys are pretty important.
Oh, sure. They're very important, and the fact that you got to keep these guys as healthy as possible. We're just talking about rehab of two significant parts of this offense that's got to go in a positive fashion throughout the off season. And the head athletic trainer has a large input on all of that kind of stuff in rehabs, and also keeping guys as healthy as possible during the season, because everybody gets banged up in the NFL by the time you head down the stretch. Everybody's got bumps and bruises. So they are sort of one of those behind-the-scenes people nobody thinks about, but are very, very important to the team. And it's just another example of Super Bowl attrition. I just talked about, sort of the satiation, the satisfaction of winning a title. Some guys say, okay, we did it. Let's walk away. I don't know if that's why Chris is doing it. If you look at the statements and quotes, he talks about spending time with his family. It's a grind. This sport is a grind. We're on here every day. Everybody talks about the off season in the NFL. There is no off season. It continuously goes and goes and goes. And for a guy like the trainer of a team, even more than most, because you do have all these off-season injuries, all these off-season maintenance surgeries. And so they have to do all that rehab and set it up and make sure the players are on the right track. It's a very difficult and time-consuming job.
Yeah. Just for the record, that we work every day. Everybody else, we don't get an off-season, John. Even when there's not a lot to talk about, we dig stuff up for the people.
Exactly. Yeah, but, in the NFL, there's always something to talk about. Look at this team. We got a new offensive coordinator. We got. I joked the old Cheers episode, Deuce Staley getting an extra title to make him happy. The head athletic trainer walks away. Alshon Jeffrey all of a sudden is having surgery. It never stops with this team.
Nope. It always seems to have something, as we talked about today. Some news that came out is that Alshon Jeffrey had rotator cuff surgery to repair a torn rotator cuff that he injured during training camp, and he played throughout the season. We didn't really touch on that a whole heck of a lot. Some people kind of scoffed at him getting that contract extension. He's not a number one wide receiver. He should have never got that. And I thought he deserved the contract based on the fact, the guy was a valuable red zone threat. But you wonder how much that injury, and how much the Eagles knew that maybe didn't allow him to be the player that they thought they were getting.
Yeah, and everything about this injury is strange because, if anything, Alshon got better as the year went on, and he was very effective in the Super Bowl, obviously. Made 2 great catches in the Super Bowl, was very effective in the NFC Championship game as well. So he seemed to get stronger and stronger as the season wore on, and you thought that was just getting accustomed to the offense, getting accustomed to Nick Foles as he came in for Carson Wentz. He did struggle early. Maybe he was dealing with it, but I can tell you from talking to him every week, he never uttered a word about it or talked anything about it.
By the way, there's a guy had 12
on the injury report.
12 touchdown catches in his 19 games this year, including the playoffs. So he was, 69 catches, 12 of them for touchdowns. This guy was. I don't know that you can complain with the production. Yeah, did you want him to maybe have more yards, if anything? But touchdowns is what I think you care about, and big catches and first downs and extending stuff. And I thought Jeffrey was very valuable in the red zone and in the touchdown 12. I mean, you can't argue with that.
No, and I don't think, and I say it all the time, of all the major sports, football is the least statistical game, whereas he had so much import to the rest of the offense in what he was able to do to open up space for Nelson Aguilar, Zach Ertz, receivers like that. He was such an improvement over what this team had before. Yeah, I mean, you'd always want Randy Moss numbers, 1,500 yards, 15, 18 touchdowns, but as you mentioned, that's a lot of production, and he got better and better as we mentioned as the season wore on. Played his best in the biggest games. Maybe that was his best game of the year, the Super Bowl. To be honest, he guaranteed the win, and he produced. He kind of set the tone early in that game with the great catch. And then he had another great over-the-shoulder catch. People kind of forget about that one. He played really, really well, and there's a reason the Eagles rewarded him. They knew what he did for this offense, whether the numbers showed it or not.
John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com, at JF McMullen on the Boardwalk Honda hotline. John, you wrote today about the tricky timing of Carson Wentz's injury. Now, you have stated that you think he will be, in fact, I think you said pretty emphatically, without a question, he'll be ready for week number 1. I'm not so sure. And that's why the Foles thing is so very intriguing. But tell the people a little bit about your article today, your column, The Tricky Timing of Carson Wentz's Injury.
Well, if you remember when Carson talked in late January, the first time really he talked since he tore the ACL, he confirmed there was also a torn LCL. And, we kind of knew that. Dr. Chow, the football doctor, used to be the Chargers team physician, sort of diagnoses things through video, does an amazing job. He mentioned that was a significant possibility, that was also torn. Turns out that was correct. And you don't have to go back very far. That's the Robert Griffin III injury. So I'm not trying to scare people. But if you remember RG3, and the run he had in his rookie season, winning the NFC East, winning all those games in a row, and then having sort of going out on his shield in the playoffs against Seattle with the injury, which torn the ACL, torn LCL, never been the same again. And I talked to a surgeon at the Hospital for Special Surgery in New York. He mentioned it does have an impact. Carson said it doesn't. So it turns 6 to 9 months sort of into 9 months to 12 months. Now, we all know how hard Carson Wentz works. So from that standpoint, I don't think you have to worry about him slacking off on his rehab or anything of that nature. So if you do put it at 9 months, he was injured on December 10th. 9 months exactly would be September 10th. The opener September 6th, the Thursday night game. We'll see who they play because they're the Super Bowl champions. So that obviously is a very, very tricky time frame. Essentially, it's 9 months. I do believe he will be cleared. He will be ready. He will have to wear a brace, however. But it does make the thinking over Nick Foles, it does change it at least a little bit if you want sort of to have that safety net like the Eagles had this season. Ultimately, it's a difficult decision, and we talked about a lot for Howie Roseman because Nick Foles is never going to be hotter than right now. He's just not. If for some reason, Mike, things go horribly, horribly wrong with Carson Wentz and Nick Foles has to play significant time, I think you and I both know it's not going to be like the Super Bowl in the NFC Championship game. He's going to be an average to slightly above average quarterback. And if you keep him around for that, well, there's not going to be two number ones or two number twos on the table like Bill Polian thinks,
right,
or two number ones like Peter King thinks. So if you get an offer for a number one draft choice, what do you do if you're Howie Roseman? I still say it's about building a dynasty here, and if you are going to build a dynasty, it's going to be Carson Wentz. So you almost have to cross your fingers and spin Nick Foles off for as much as you can.
Yeah, I mean, look, and what Polian said the other day, forget that, the part when we discussed this the other day, but I'll bring it back up, was, he called him an icon. And he said, look, that guy's an icon in this town. That's where it gets difficult. And we saw this with the Phillies, John, with, they didn't want to trade Utley because of his popularity and all those guys. Rollins, we couldn't trade Rollins. They couldn't trade Howard. Well, mainly Howard because nobody was going to take that contract. But, Utley and Rollins were two guys that they were afraid to pull the trigger on because they just didn't want to, rock the apple cart.
Yeah, and I get it, but I'll also say this. When you talk about those particular players, Ryan Howard at one time was obviously an MVP-level player. Chase Utley and Jimmy Rollins were consistent all-star type players. They did a lot for that organization year to year, and obviously ultimately winning the World Series. Did they hang on too long? Yeah, obviously. But that's not what Nick Foles is. Nick Foles isn't a consistent Pro Bowl player. He got hot at the right time. He deserves all the credit in the world. He is an icon. He is going to be loved forever in this city. We talked about all the tattoos with Nick Foles' face on them. But I do think most Eagles fans are educated enough to know he's not Ryan Howard or what Ryan Howard once was. He's not an all-star level player like Chase Utley was or Jimmy Rollins was. He was a guy who came off the bench and got hot at the right time. He was Jeff Hostetler. And that's great, and he deserves all the accolades he can get, but you got to be realistic about it. And to me, as I mentioned on the show yesterday, I believe, from a football standpoint, I think this is a pretty easy decision. But Bill is right by bringing up the emotional part of it is far more difficult.
Yeah. And keep in mind, too, like Doug Williams, for example, he was the MVP of the Super Bowl for the Washington Redskins. So, I mean, he came in as a backup, becomes the Super Bowl MVP. but realistically, after that run, was not a great quarterback.
No, and I think, Nick, I think Nick deserves to be a starting quarterback in this league. But if you're going from 1 through 32, I think he would be on the bottom end of that list. He would be, sort of minus 16. And it's not something you hold on to because you want to just have a feel-good moment with the fan base. You already have the feel-good moment. And you should. If Nick Foles, for instance, is traded and comes back here, you should have a Nick Foles day, and you should honor him. And I think there's no question the Eagles would do that. But Carson Wentz is the franchise quarterback of this team. And even if he isn't ready week 1, if he isn't ready for the first month, which I don't think is going to happen, but even if that's the case, I think you understand this is about the future as a whole, and he's going to hopefully be here for 10 years playing at a high level, and what you want to do is build up around him. And if you can garner significant draft capital by spinning off Nick Foles, who, if you keep him and you bring the band back together, so to speak, in that quarterback room, which you can do from a financial standpoint, then next season he's going to walk anyway to become a starting quarterback.
Just for reference,
you're going to have to redo Carson.
Just for reference, by the way, 87, Doug Williams started 2 games, was 0-2, and then went on to win the Super Bowl MVP. The next year he came back as the starter for Washington, went 4-6 with 15 touchdowns and 12 interceptions. The following year he started 2 games, went 1-1 through 1 touchdown and 3 picks. So, he had this great run in the Super Bowl, Doug did, after playing just like Nick, played very few games as the starter, started 2 games, 0-2, which he played pretty well in those 2 games, by the way, 11 touchdowns, 5 interceptions, and then went to win the Super Bowl MVP, and then the very next season he was not very good. But we'll see. I mean, and look, the one thing is Washington needed him to be the starter the very next year. The Eagles do not need Nick to be the starter the very next year. Hey, look, I don't think anybody out there can tell you this is an easy decision for Philadelphia. To be the Super Bowl champions and have this decision, I would almost say that it would almost be easier if he was a free agent just to say somebody blew him away.
Yeah, well, I don't look at it that way because I think Howie looks at it as a position of strength, and he doesn't have to do anything, so he can sort of sit back and wait for the Sam Bradford scenario in desperation. And if that pops up somewhere in this league, and all of a sudden maybe a second, a third round pick turns into a 1 and a 2, then you pull the trigger. And if that never comes, then maybe you do stand pat and say, we're not 100% about Carson early in the season. So let's keep the safety net and let's keep everyone happy and have Nick and just move forward the next year. And you won't get anything in return for him, but there are worse things in the world. The good part for Howie and the Eagles as a whole, they built up such cachet now from winning the Super Bowl. It doesn't matter what path they choose. They're going to be given a mulligan, whether it works or it doesn't work. Because this group, Howie Roseman, Joe Douglas, Doug Peterson, they now have a long, long shelf life in Philadelphia. In the case of Joe Douglas, he'll probably move on for a GM position at some point. But you get my point. If they want to be here, they're going to be here because they won the Super Bowl. So they can afford a few mistakes. And I don't think it's a difficult decision for Howie, but I do think he will milk it for all it's worth and wait until he finds a desperate suitor.
John McMullen on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline, and read his off-season NFL news and notes, his columns at 973ESPN.com. Follow him on Twitter at JF McMullen. Thanks, pal.
Hey, thanks, Mike.